to all of you, and a warm welcome to everyone who is here in person or online to join us for today's important discussion. Any conversation these days about and with Pakistan, of course, must begin with our expression of sympathy and condolences for the challenges that Pakistan continues to face as a result of the historic floods. The scale of the damage is unimaginable. 33 million people affected, nearly 8 million people displaced. Right now, more than 3 million children and thousands of pregnant women are in immediate need of assistance. I know from my time leading the U.S. Agency for International Development just how destructive floods can be and just how long the road to recovery will be. And so I am confident that the U.S. will continue to stand with Pakistan in its time of need, but I'm also confident in the character and resilience of the Pakistani people. The road ahead is not an easy one, but my money is on the people of Pakistan. It is great that the U.S. government has responded as quickly as it has and as generously as it has always done for Pakistan in its time of need, whether it be the 2005 earthquake or the 2010 flooding, or again, the challenges of today. The Biden administration sent a senior interagency delegation to Pakistan, and we have since seen USAID working to bring badly needed supplies to the hardest hit areas. I always bring up the response because people sometimes don't realize the complexity of the challenges that Pakistan will face. It isn't merely about the money. We always stand with our friends financially in times of need. Pakistan has tremendous capacity and intellectual and technical might, but the scale of these floods exceed any possible capacity or preparedness. And again, we look forward to working so closely with you in the time ahead. The assistance and this relationship renewal is coming at an encouraging moment in Pakistan's relationship with the U.S. And perhaps that's one very small bright note in this time of darkness and tragedy, how closely we are working together and how much this reminds us of shared values and shared principles. But of course, the relationship with Pakistan, which is very important in so many ways, is about much, much more than responding in times of humanitarian need. We are starting to see, more than a year out from the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the contours of a new type of U.S.-Pakistani relationship, one that focuses on more than merely security issues. Our new ambassador to Pakistan, Donald Blome, recently announced a new bilateral health dialogue. More and more high-level exchanges are taking place to discuss trade and investment and shared interests. The top State Department official focused on investment, Special Representative for Commercial and Business Affairs, Bilawal Saeed, who happens to be a Pakistani American, spent several days recently in Pakistan exploring some of the possibilities in the relationship. All of this is very encouraging. I must say that the U.S.-Pakistan relationship and Pakistan more broadly are major priorities for us at the Wilson Center. We have a long legacy of careful and nuanced research and scholarship on Pakistan. We have in our ranks former ambassador to Pakistan, David Hale, a scholar with us at the Wilson Center. We also are expanding this work in coming months with a brand new Pakistan initiative, which includes a new Pakistan Fellowship Program. It will be housed in our new South Asia initiative, which is led by my colleague, Michael Kugelman. Enough of me. You are not here to hear me speak, so I look forward to, like the rest of you, listening to the foreign minister share his thoughts about the U.S.-Pakistan relationship and on Pakistan's foreign policy priorities more broadly. But first, I turn things back to Michael Kugelman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Green. We really are delighted to welcome the Foreign Minister. He will offer some remarks, and then he and I will take a seat at the table and have a conversation before we open up to questions from the audience. So with that, I'd like to invite the Foreign Minister to the podium for his comments.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here at the Wilson Institute today. I believe when we planned to be at the United Nations and to follow up with our bilateral trip in Washington, D.C., our agenda perhaps would have been different. But by the time I was making my way to the United States, the ground realities in Pakistan had fundamentally shifted. As a speaker before me noted, these are no normal monsoons and no normal floods. We are used to monsoons, we are used to floods, we have provincial mechanisms, national mechanisms to deal with such disaster. What we were not prepared for was for floods to descend from the sky, to form such a large body of water in the middle of our country that could literally be seen from space, and that is still eking its way to the ocean, leaving devastation in its wake. How does one overnight cater to the needs of 33 million people, greater than the population of Sri Lanka, New Zealand, Australia, 95% of Canada, more than the people in all of New York State? And this is a compounding tragedy. We're still in the rescue and relief phase, but we see how this is going to get a lot more difficult. Because not only do we have the immediate destruction of the floods, that, as I mentioned, 33 million people, 16 million children, 600,000 pregnant women waiting to give birth. But now with this massive body of water that'll take many months to either descend into the sea or evaporate, we're looking at, as the WHO has warned, a second catastrophe, a health catastrophe, with waterborne diseases spreading at epidemic rates and our supplies of basics like Panadol and anti-malaria medication not being able to keep up. And if the 33 million people have been affected, I mean, if you've seen the images, I'm sure there's been videos on social media, etc., of the masses of mosquitoes rising from these waters and forming large clouds above. It is truly an apocalyptic scene. Now, not only do we have the flood climate catastrophe, the health disaster, but at least 4 million plus acres of standing crop or cash crop was destroyed in these floods. The income of small farmers was largely agricultural areas where we have been affected. And one often looks at the images on TV, particularly from far away, and there's this impression that these are all incredibly, impoverished people, and absolutely Pakistan has a problem with poverty. But I must explain that amongst those 33 million people, the large majority of which were not impoverished before the floods. They were earning their way. They were taking care of their families, of the earnings of their lands. Now they are homeless and impoverished. And the devastation on the standing crops mean that now we're going to face food insecurity. We all know we were anyway threatened with that because of Ukraine and supply line issues. Now there's a serious threat. And anybody who's been following Pakistan particularly closely while all of this was happening, they'll know that we were in a very difficult, like everybody else is in a very difficult economic situation, but we were in a particularly perilous economic situation because of some decisions that had been taken in violation of IMF program that our finance minister was on record as saying Pakistan was in danger of default. And we had managed to pull us back from the brink and get our second tranche, sorry, not second tranche, agree to the new tranche and agree extension from the IMF. And that money literally came in the middle of August as the rains were descending. But all those estimates, all those figures might as well have been washed away with the floods as well. So we're staring at an incredibly difficult economic situation as well. Now, as the speaker before me mentioned, the people of Pakistan are incredibly resilient. We have time and time, in fact, they've been far more resilient than they need to be. But this is not a crisis of their making. We contribute, Pakistan, 0.8% of the global carbon footprint. And literally, the 33 million people of Pakistan are paying in the form of their lives, in the form of their livelihoods, for global warming that they didn't create. So as the UN Secretary General has stated, this is not about charity. This is about economic justice. And we've heard time and time again about how the country I'm standing in, Europe, all the great powers are combating climate change, are not only taking climate change so seriously themselves, but are championing the cause around the world. We hear about the Green Climate Fund and $100 billion annual commitment to fight climate change. Well, guess what? When your country is drowning in a 100-kilometer lake and a third of the landmass of your country is underwater, you find out there's no money. There's no international financial infrastructure to deal with the calamity of this scale. There is the loss and damage is a conversation we're still debating about happening. And that is incredibly frustrating. But now this is the opportunity in this crisis. That Pakistan's message is that it is us today, it could be anybody else tomorrow. And while we work to ensure we get the funds for our rescue and relief, while we have a clear vision about how we don't only want to reconstruct our reconstruction and rehabilitation place to take place, but we want to do so in a climate-resistant manner, a greener manner. Yes, we too aspire to build back better. So while we have that clear vision, and we engage with international financial institutions, and there's novel ideas to discuss with, rather than the great powers, we should say the great polluters, to discuss with the great polluters about debt swap and other mechanisms that may help us here and now. What we have to do is ensure that while there was no script for us, while there was no ready-made plan for us, that the next time this happens to some other country, we are more prepared. And in our country, in our efforts to bring our people to stand on their own feet, for our country to stand on their own feet, we commit ourselves, because we would have never otherwise had such extensive investment in all of these areas that have been devastated by the floods. And now there are two options for us. Either we do it cheaply and poorly and dirtily and wait for the next floods for them to be washed away again, or we do it right. We become the test case, the leaders, for what we've heard, and only heard, about this green infrastructure, climate resilient infrastructure. And I honestly believe that domestically and internationally now, whatever our political preoccupations are. We have to understand the gravity of the situation. Before these floods, this was tomorrow's problem for us. We were working on green energy and solar energy and wind energy, and yeah, not everything's great, but we'd get there. And we'd seen historic floods that were devastating before, but we got over them. Now there's an urgency of now. And I don't wish upon anybody else to discover this urgency in the manner that we've discovered it today. So whether it's our domestic politics in Pakistan that is incredibly highly polarized, that too needs to accept the gravity of the situation and rise to the challenge. But in the international geopolitical space as well, we have to ask ourselves what history will say of the choices that humanity made when they were faced with an existential threat. We saw how during the COVID pandemic, a once in 100-year COVID pandemic that is still not over, that we did not rise to the challenge. It would have been incredibly inspirational if we had seen the President of the United States stand with the President in China and announce how we, as the human race, would defeat this existential threat. Unfortunately, we were arguing over whether it was the Wuhan virus or the China virus and how fascist it was for us to wear masks or to do lockdowns. And we suffered as a result, and we are still suffering as a result. We have a climate catastrophe that is spiraling out of control. The 10 most climate-stressed countries, out of which Pakistan is one, have contributed negligibly to the overall carbon footprint, but they are going to be the frontline victims. And this is what history will ask us, that while our planet was burning, while we were being warned time and time again, from Gore to Greta, that the climate is in imminent danger, do we choose to ignite new conflicts, provoke new tensions, busy ourselves with the conflicts of man? Or did we rise to this occasion? And let me be absolutely clear. We will not overcome climate change. We will not save our planet if China and the United States do not work together on climate. Everything else can wait. Every other conflict, every other dispute. We'll all fight amongst ourselves if there's a planet left to fight over. Up until then, there needs to be an awakening that this is the time for unity. This is the time for multilateralism. This is not the time for war. Imagine the carbon footprint of Ukraine. I mean, this is an absolutely, I can't condemn, but farcical series of events. You can't lecture on climate, on green energy, on how we must work together while we continue to engage in conflicts. And I honestly have insisted and will continue to insist that the path to peace is through dialogue and diplomacy. The catastrophes that we are facing, the challenges that we are facing, are truly that of a global making, and surely the solutions are also global. I have no doubt that if we do work together within my own country, we will be able to surmount the challenges we're facing today. If we do work together internationally, we will be able to confront the challenge that we're facing today. If we're going into many other decades of pointless geopolitical conflict, I'd like to be told, because I think that means the planet's going to warm so much that we won't be able to live here, and I, for one, would prefer to enjoy the time we have left rather than pointlessly go about in circles. This has to be a cause that is championed by the new generation, and I must say, as the party who's advocated for environment and climate in Pakistan, it was always very difficult to have that as part of the populist discourse. I believe a tragedy of this scale will now allow us to make this front and center in the Pakistani political discourse, and I hope that the great polluters decide that they'll pause until we can survive. They will help the victims of their industrialization get over this catastrophe, and we work together for a more just world through concepts such as climate justice, peace, dialogue, diplomacy, just until we can figure out how to survive. And then there'll be many other centuries for us to fight our wars. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Foreign Minister. I think you very eloquently articulated these challenges that Pakistan faces, particularly related to climate. I wanted to pose a few questions to you. One, following up what you said in your comments. Last week, I believe it was, in one of your public engagements, you spoke about the need for a green Marshall Plan I believe you said that. Extensive investments in Pakistan over time to make it a more climate resilient place. So it's an admirable idea, one that many would support, but it's also a very ambitious idea, and I would argue that it might be a hard sell. So I would ask you, what is your pitch to the international donor community and to the world on the whole about why it's worth making such major financial investments in Pakistan, a country that's struggled with corruption?
Can I turn on your...
It's on.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, please. So what's your pitch to the international?
First of all, thank you. I spoke on the sidelines of COP27, and I must say I was inspired by the pleas by small island nations and other countries who are literally advocating for their own survival. I understand that the Green Marshall Plan will not have any buyers in the current Congress, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't advocate for what I believe is the solution. And actually, I never pitched it specifically for Pakistan. The conversation, and as I said, inspired by the very passionate speakers along my side at this COP conversation, was that what is necessary, particularly for climate-stressed countries who, even if they put their entire budgets to this cause, would not be able to survive the catastrophe of climate change, is the concept of a Green Marshall Plan. And the idea being that not only do we prepare, make ourselves climate resilient, adapt, mitigate, lead our energy transition. I also believe that, once upon a time, the United States used to take such a prominent leading role in the world. And I believe that today, too, you have the skills, you have the technology, you have the finances, you have the ability to champion this cause, not lead it alone, but champion this cause, and create an impact in the way that there's the talk, but the talk is followed up by action. This concept of a Green Marshall Plan is just a vehicle or a suggestion. It is the President of the United States, and I think it's the G7, and everybody's stated objective to want to build a climate resilient infrastructure across the world and lead the transition. So I think it meets really well the stated position on climate and a practical path forward. I also think that this, while the government-to-government stuff and the public sector stuff, there's a room for that, to be able to reach the scale of the work that needs to be done, we have to engage the private sector. Then there's an opportunity for the private sector domestically and internationally, given the various global challenges, to create new partnerships for new investments in infrastructure on a global scale. And the commitment to finance is also already there. It's not what I came up with. I mean, COP26 happened before I was foreign minister. And so there was supposed to be this idea of $100 billion annually coming somewhere. And I believe that even if we can't put our money where our mouth is because we're spending it in other places, there's still ways and means and options for us to find ways to come up with the financing. There's the a debt swap suggestion that is not mine, but that of the UN Secretary General. I mean, he was speaking in the context of UN sort of sustainable development goals and how we've been completely knocked off post-COVID and everything else. And his suggestion is that that there's a debt swap for to be able to finance that infrastructure. Similarly, within the climate context, there's there could be a path forward if we were to conceivably suggest that that target that everybody is, or whoever is committed to, that they would raise $100 billion a year. If they're not coming up in actual cash, you can do it in a debt swap format and count it towards your climate debt. And finally, on your point about corruption, I mean, corruption is everywhere all across the planet, particularly here where I am in the United States today. It doesn't mean you damn the people of those countries to the consequences of climate change. It is our responsibility, absolutely, to come up with mechanisms that are more transparent, that give investors and donors confidence in what they're doing. I think right now, where we are actually physically in the middle of a crisis, it's difficult to come up with that infrastructure, but going forward, something that I talked about with the Pakistani American business community here today was a suggestion to deploy new technology where we can trace your donation or your commitment or your expenditure sort of from the time you donated to the source, and we talked through ways about how to materialize that and what would be possible. But fundamentally, yeah, corruption exists, waste exists, all the awful things in the world exist. We still have to deal not only with an actual natural disaster, but the consequences of climate change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So just a few questions beyond the issue of flood relief. I know that's your immediate goal, as it should be, but just a few broader foreign policy questions for you. Starting with the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, it appears to have experienced some momentum. You, of course, met with the Secretary of State yesterday. What are some specific areas where you think the two sides can cooperate moving forward?
So I'm incredibly encouraged. This is as I said yesterday in my talk at the State Department, that it's, diplomacy is back, and that's incredibly heartening. I'm sure no matter what we think of each other's positions on a whole host of issues, we can all agree that if we're not talking to each other, if we're not engaging with each other, that doesn't serve my interest, and it doesn't serve the interest of the United States government, the United States people. I must say, not only am I presently surprised, I am absolutely impressed with the new approach of United States foreign policy to Pakistan. We have, for far too long, seen each other through the context of, or the prism of Afghanistan, and it was heartening to note throughout my engagements, my initial engagements all the way up to now, how we're broadening that conversation. And we don't just talk about Afghanistan, and we don't just think about Afghanistan. And we're talking about enhancing trade and economic cooperation in energy, in agriculture, in health, as you mentioned. And okay, it was, wasn't going to be super turbo speed, but at practical pace, as was noted before I spoke, there's been consistent engagement, including, and not limited to, the visit of Mr. Dilawar Saeed for many days in Pakistan, where he visited Islamabad and many provinces and had extensive discussions about business and trade opportunities. And that is exactly the sort of space that I think any bilateral relationship should be in. There's also an increasing feeling in our interactions that we're no longer hyphenated. So we're not AFPAC or PAC India, PAC US, and I think that's a good thing. So there's an incredible positive aura around all of our engagements so far. But again, now, my pitch at this point in time is the ground realities have absolutely changed. There's been a fundamental shift. It's a different Pakistan. This is going to be a humanitarian disaster for the history books if we can't get a handle on it. And in that context, I think even though it's an incredibly hard sell, as you say, there's feelings about my country on Capitol Hill that'll take a time to address. But the opportunity in this crisis, and the thing that I'll continue to pitch, even if I have to hear just to know, is that this is the time for even enhanced engagement. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned in my statement yesterday, the dams that the Secretary Blinken was talking about in his speech were built in the 60s and 70s, and that was our last green revolution in Pakistan. It's not just Pakistan. There are many climate-stressed countries, and this is an opportunity for us to work in a far more extensive mode of cooperation.
So you talk about expanding the relationship beyond the Afghanistan lens that was there for so long, but do you think there still is potential for security and especially counterterrorism cooperation with an eye toward Afghanistan?
So I think security and CT cooperation is now a thing all over the world for our own internal security, and there's definitely not just with the United States, but with a lot of our regional, with a lot of our neighbors, concerns about terrorism. There's Al-Qaeda, TTP for us, ETIM for China. So that's obviously an area of incredible concern, and it is a point which we consistently engage with the Afghan interim government on. We want to see them have the capacity to be able to deal with all these challenges. But the reason we confront extremism and terrorism, particularly within our own country, and this is a point I want to emphasize, particularly within our own country, is not because it threatens the United States. This is something that has threatened us, that has caused us to lose 80,000 civilians in Pakistan. We had terrorist attacks almost every other day during a painful period in our history, and none of us want to go back to that.
So thank you. One more question to you before we go to our audience. The previous government announced what was heralded as a major shift in foreign policy, one from geopolitics to geoeconomics. Some of us never quite understood what that meant, but it appears to be a shift toward a phase where Pakistan would be emphasizing trade, connectivity in the region. If you could give your view on that shift, if that still is a policy for this government, and what you make of that idea.
The old government had a lovely habit of naming everything it did as the first time it has ever happened in the history of Pakistan. But the fact of the matter is there's been a consistent attempt actually to do that. Obviously, it's very difficult when you have the Afghan war going on your border. But I don't know if anybody will remember when President Zardari was president and we were fighting terrorism, we had all those issues, but his pitch on the international stage was always trade over aid. Even then, despite, I remind you, in 2010, it was the first time after 1965 where Pakistan started trading with India. We unilaterally started trade. So I think there has been efforts, more substantial efforts, in the past to break out of geopolitical gridlock and regional tensions and push trade. And absolutely, as a stated position of the last government, that they would focus on economics. I mean, that's something that should be appreciated and continued. But the challenges to that is manifold, not only for us, but also the international community. And again, it brings us back to our point. I think all of us, I mean, all these little groups that are being made, and wherever you go, if you actually talk to everyone in Quad or in other places behind closed doors and away from the cameras, they will tell you that no one wants conflict. They would much rather be trading and doing business in an open and free environment without pressures and without geopolitical concerns. I think this is a matter of everyone's survival, really. If you talk to anyone in the United States or anyone in Europe or anywhere else, there's a lot of economic anxiety. And because we see that these conflicts developing may not ease very quickly, there's an anxiety about that. So I would actually hope that all countries, particularly given the economic devastation following the once-in-a-lifetime pandemic that we're still seeing, would prioritize economics over geopolitics for a bit.
Okay, thank you. So we have a number of questions that have come in from the audience online, but I wanted to take a few here from our audience here. So if you could raise your hand and just wait until there's a microphone in front of you before you pose your question. So we'll start on this side of the room. Yeah, we'll start with Pam Constable. And please give your name and affiliation.
It's still Pam Constable.
That's what I thought. Thanks.
From the Washington Post.
Oh, okay. I think
nice
we're meeting.
To see many of you here, and Mr. Foreign Minister. I have a brief rhetorical question, which you don't have to answer, and a longer, more serious one, which I hope you will. It's regarding the hyphenated relationships. And there was a recent meeting between Narendra Modi and Vladimir Putin in which Mr. Modi said, "This is not the time for war." I wonder if you were quoting him intentionally or just agreeing.
I agree.
That was my rhetorical question. So my serious question is about Sindh. It's about your world. And I, during the last serious monsoon of June 2010, I spent some time in Sindh, visited a number of very badly affected places, Jacobabad, for example, Tata. And I was very struck by a number of things. One was the sort of inequality of the control of water, irrigation, and the other was, even to my surprise, so many of the people that I met were completely landless. They were living on crop shares. They were living on nothing. So my question is really, what has changed since then, if anything? Obviously, this is a much, much, much worse situation, but it's the same situation in a sense. It comes from the same cause as well as from the sky. One of the complaints that I heard from many of the landless or the very poor farmers in 2010 was that many of the larger landowners, the big zamindars, the big people who owned land, were diverting water from their areas, were actually breaking down embankments, were trying to divert the problem of the flood away from their lands. And people just told me this directly. I mean,
Yeah.
what had happened to them. And that's just one thing. You were saying how the situation there is better economically now, that, you were saying people were owning their own lands. I'd like to know what has changed in those last 10 years,
Thanks.
particularly regarding flood
Sure.
prevention
Perfect.
and help.
Thank you. Very comprehensive question. As far as the comment that I had made that everybody was not poor, is this the 33 million people? So there's a percentage of that were below the poverty line, and there's been a number of challenges to our fight with poverty. But what these floods have done is overnight, it's not just the landless or the incredibly poor who are obviously outsizely effective. What I was trying to communicate was that the small farmer, the small business owner, the ones who were eking out a living before this, they too have been impoverished overnight by this devastation. As far as combating poverty in Pakistan is concerned, we've actually had a positive story to sell on that for a couple of reasons for quite some time. One, under the last federally controlled Pakistan People's Party government, we launched our country's first social safety net, the Benazir Income Support Program, that provided cash transfers directly to the poorest of the poor, and has had a direct impact on alleviating poverty. In my province of Sindh, simultaneously, we launched a provincial program to combat poverty through a Sindh rural support organization, and what we call the People's Poverty Program, that provided interest-free loans to women, particularly the poorest of the poor, for them to start their own businesses. And it's actually an incredible success story. We had more than 1 million women benefiting from this program that had spread to all districts of the province by 2018. So it was slowly and steadily, it started with the sort of the most impoverished areas and was spread across the province. So 1 million women benefiting from this, becoming small business women themselves. And I have to say that lending money to women is far more effective than lending money normally through commercial banks. The stats on this initiative show that 97% return rate on our loans to poor women. That shows not only the efficiency and effectiveness of the program, but also that it was working. So what's the sad story? As the UN Secretary General said, we've been knocked back decades. Our improvement in tackling poverty, knocked back 10 years by COVID, by the supply chain issues that are a result of that, by the whirlwind of inflation that's engulfed the globe following the conflict in Ukraine and the sanctions over there. And now, above and beyond that, we have the devastation that's caused from the floods. As far as climate justice, we actually have a topic from our perspective in Sindh on water justice, and we absolutely believe that the irrigation system is unfairly managed, particularly given that we're a lower riparian, and not only a lower riparian to India, but the lower riparian to the whole of the rest of the country. And that sort of leads to disputes over whether and how water is being shifted freely and fairly. Again, as I said, this catastrophe, you have a 100-kilometer lake form in the middle of the country. The devastation is a result of flooding from the skies that lasted consistently and with increasing severity from mid-June to the end of August. No one's land was saved. There's no saving anybody's land when that water, when that intensity comes from the skies. But when you're in such a desperate situation, And I've seen this firsthand. I mean, immense desperation, and you've lost absolutely everything. When you lost absolutely everything, then everything seems like it's being done against you. And it is totally legitimate for people to feel frustrated that they haven't got enough. When our chief minister is on record that he can so far only supply aid at one time to 25% of those affected. So every second person you approach will be incredibly frustrated and incredibly aggravated. As far as diverting water from here to there, so that's not a political decision in the sense that I don't make it or the chief minister doesn't make it. Engineers make those decisions about where to breach and what to do. Obviously, in desperate times, I'm sure individuals of various places try it by force themselves, but by and large, that's what happens. But no matter where the water goes, where it does go, because you're in such a difficult and desperate point,
In your talks, there's been advice about responsibly managing the relationship with India, as well as managing ties with China over debt restructuring. Parts of the press are saying that the US schooled down as well, and had some severe criticism about that F-16 service renewal deal, which you've managed to pull through. And in his remarks, he said, well, nobody in Washington or Islamabad is fooling anyone. We know that these F-16s, they say they're for counterterrorism, but frankly, we know where they're going to be used. So two questions. Did you get schooled, and are you fooling us?
Thank you, Pimdas. First of all, we had an incredibly pleasant conversation with Secretary Blinken, not just yesterday, but from the very first day that I've been Foreign Minister of Pakistan. In fact, one of my early phone calls that I received, which was supposed to be a conversation based on, initial pleasantries, congratulations for taking your job, over your new responsibilities, I think it lasted for between an hour 45, 2 hours. And it was an incredibly pleasant conversation, and we've maintained that tone throughout. And I think the sort of key to any bilateral relationship is dealing with each other with mutual respect. And I'm just so sort of floored by what you said, because anybody who knows Secretary Blinken will tell you that he's an incredible human being, and does not even speak in that tone and tenor, even if he was to discuss something of the such. As far as a responsible relationship with India, well, that's what we want, and that's what we've always wanted. As I mentioned in my sort of comments earlier, 2010 was the first time after 1965 where we unilaterally started trade with India. We took the political hit, touched the third rail of Pakistani politics, had the Defy Pakistan in every alphabet of basket of deplorables, protesting and calling us traitors and whatnot. And that was a result of the fact that we knew that us taking the political risk had the potential of being reciprocated from the other side by someone who also wanted a responsible relationship with Pakistan. But as you and I know, a lot has changed since 2010. And from our perspective, this is a very different India. Mr. Modi is not Mr. Manmohan Singh or even Mr. Vajpayee. He is the same prime minister who, until he became prime minister, could not come to the United States. You wouldn't give him a visa because of the massacre that occurred in Gujarat. And while we all hoped, and as some like to say, hope is not a plan, that things would go differently, they didn't. He's quite actively and with concentrated purpose over the course of his the only portion, a piece of under their control that still has a Muslim majority was Kashmir. And since August 2019, they have been violating international law and proactively converting that Muslim majority into a minority in their own land. And that makes it incredibly difficult for us to engage. We definitely want, particularly the younger generation, to live in a peaceful neighborhood. We're not as burdened by the baggage of history. But to have a reasonable, responsible relationship, you need responsible, reasonable neighbors. And at the moment, the space hasn't been developed.
Well, thank you. In the few minutes we have left, I wanted to go to Akil here, and then there's one or two questions I wanted to throw from the online audience.
Sure.
So please.
F-16? Oh, I mean,
Sorry, yeah.
come on. Obviously, the Indians are upset. They're going to be upset about it. Let them be. Kya kare?
Akil Shah, I'm affiliated with the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm sure you're keenly aware that the sort of toxic polarization within Pakistani politics, spearheaded by what you've called the selected former Prime Minister of Pakistan, not only has detrimental effects on Pakistan's democracy and its democratic institutions, but also in its foreign relations. So I'm wondering how that pernicious polarization, even around the issue of the floods, which he has sort of played a sort of spoiler role, how does that affect your ability to engage the international community, especially the United States, which he has accused of regime change? And two, given that domestic polarization, as the head of a political party, can you identify a couple of mechanism or ways that we can deal with that polarization? Because it's a matter of not just domestic politics but also foreign policy. Thank you.
And before you get to that, a number of people online asked about Afghanistan. So if you could just talk about Pakistan's approach to how it wants to deal with the Taliban-led Afghanistan, and especially the TTP issue.
I'll get to that.
Yeah.
Polarization. Luckily for foreign policy, most of the world is happy to ignore Imran Khan, and that really, no hiccups in foreign policy with anywhere that we engage with. As far as domestic politics, you're absolutely right. It's incredibly destructive. This has been particularly my perspective, not only now from when we're in government, but also when we're in opposition. And frankly, democracy only works if we all want it to work, and particularly as fragile the democracy is and as difficult our history in Pakistan, we've gotten to a place where things had just about started to function. Sort of not so pretty, but democracy isn't pretty anywhere. But we had the institutional, normative, constitutional, rights-based progress that had taken place between 2008 to 2013, and even a bit between 2013 to 2018. It was the most democratic space, perhaps, that Pakistan has seen for a lot of its history. But with this overtly particularly his own style of exclusionary politics. It's us and nobody else. Like literally a third of the country can be drowning and it doesn't matter. I will continue to do my political shows everywhere else where it is dry. That's the sort of inhumane sort of level that you're brought to when you talk about exclusion, us versus them, otherize your opponents to the extent that literally when they're drowning, you will still prefer to do politics, is incredibly difficult in Pakistan's context, but it's also not a uniquely Pakistani problem anymore. And the scariest thing is that we've seen even a country as great and as old and as far as its democratic traditions are concerned, a 200-year-old American democracy. And if everybody doesn't just want the basics to work, if they think that the rules are for everybody else, but the rules are not for me, then even the light on this, shining city on the hill begins to dim. And that's incredibly terrifying, honestly. That you could have 200 years of institutional democracy and it can falter. And then imagine the fragility of the democracy in Pakistan when faced with this sort of polarization, where you're not only not ready to talk during the floods. I mean, this happened when he was prime minister. We faced terrorist attack, he refused to sit with the opposition. The incident I mentioned in Kashmir, when that happened, he still refused to sit with the opposition. Time and time again, it was a one-man show that Parliament didn't apply, rules didn't apply, and the Constitution didn't apply. That's not a there's no sort of long game there. Even today, my advice to Imran Khan would be, respect democracy, respect democratic institutions, do your job. You've got X amount of MNAs who are still collecting their salary and have refused to come into Parliament for the many past months. And look beyond one's personal ego to go to Afghanistan. Sorry, but that's how the questions were asked. So look, I think my personal opinions on the various groups that you're referring to, whether it's TTP or TTA, are very well known, and I don't want to repeat them. But even I, particularly in the context of what I do, am a proponent and an advocate for engagement with the interim government in Afghanistan. And because I believe that if we repeat the mistakes of the past, wash our hands of the disaster in Afghanistan and say that this is not our mess, then it'll become an even bigger mess, not only for us, but for everybody else. If we don't engage, we will not be able to ensure an expansion of rights for women. If we don't engage, we will not be able to ensure that the issue of sort of the functioning of terrorist groups is tackled in the way that it needs to be tackled for the international community to be safe and secure, or any other positives that you want out of Afghanistan. And in fact, I'd go as far to say that if we do disengage, and particularly the economic situation exacerbates over there, rather than seeing an expansion of rights, for example, for women and girls, you'll see a contraction of those rights, because we've seen throughout history, particularly theocratic, autocratic regimes, that when the economic times are tough, when the people are hungry, they look for distractions. And there has been, throughout time, a contraction of rights during this time rather than an expansion.
And on the resurgent threat of the TTP based in Afghanistan, talks didn't work, and that Taliban doesn't appear to be curbing. What's next?
Do they ever?
No, they don't. You're correct.
Look, because the entire world talked right next door, getting out of Afghanistan with a whole host of people, I think that the space for those opposed to talks were very limited in our own context. And there was another round of talks that have taken place. Out of that, the one thing that was sort of a little bit of a breather was the announcement that there would be a ceasefire from their side on this issue, which I think was positive, given this steady uptick, not significant uptick, but there's been a steady uptick sort of post the fall of Kabul compared to pre the fall of Kabul about the level of terrorist activities over there. As far as functioning these sorts of terrorist groups, whether it's my country, whether it's Afghanistan, there needs to be sort of red lines, where I don't know what the various countries' approaches to rehabilitation or reincorporation, but there needs to be fundamentals that we all understand, such as disarmament and an ensuring of peace rather than the situation getting out of control. And it's still to be seen how successful we will be in engaging on this issue, particularly in the new context following the fall of Kabul. But the answer has to be engagement. We have to build their capacity to take on these groups or terrorist groups before we can give a definitive verdict on whether they've demonstrated the will to do so. If they don't have the capacity, then how can you expect them to demonstrate the will?
Well, thank you. The hour flew by, predictably. Thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister, for taking the time to answer all the questions, for your remarks. Thanks to everyone here at the Wilson Center, and to those of you for tuning online. And again, to reiterate what Ambassador Green said, the Wilson Center is in solidarity with Pakistan as it tries to recover from these floods. So with that, please join me in a round of applause for our guests.
Thank you so much, Michael, and I hope that we're very grateful for your solidarity, and I will keep chipping away at the Green Marshall Plan, even though it may not materialize. Thanks.
Thank you very much.